Three. Tendon Pango, Jamni, Jonsa Chenzer Muchinde, Chijunan to Batella, the Naranta, Marapinja, Choni Rumbuche, Pancho Tugu, Tasanta, the Jangu Nanchu Lobjun Chicken, Gange exception, in Tabane Rumuchin, the Chijunan to Batella, Tuji Chishuin. Rumbuche is Zonsa Chenzer, which I don't need to say. He's Chukalotu. Before that, in Tibet, Chenze Wangpo is not only very learned, very high realized master. Also, the Chenses, they all study Kaju, Nyingma, Sacha, Gelu, not only philosophy, also Wang Long Tri Menga. So much is the reincarnation of Chokilodu, I mean Chenze Wangpo. So I'm very happy he really cared and loved to our Dharma students. Even difficult time, how many from foreign, how many students came? I believe around 26 national are studying intensively, like monastery way of Buddhist philosophy. So Rinpoche always he happy about that, and always he helping about that, and caring and loving. So I'm very happy today Rinpoche is here, and he is our main guest, and he will give teaching now. Thank you very much.
I was told it is supposed to be informal, and putting me on the spot was not part of the deal. Now that you have raised all the expectations from the people, I think I'm bound to fail, so I'm already nervous. Anyway, thank you, Rinpoche, for inviting me. I must offer my gratitude for including myself for this celebration. It's a big honor. I have been distant but very enthusiastic admirer of Chökyi Nyima Rinpoche and his activities, especially the manifestation of Rangjung Yeshe Institute. I have for years been observing. Anyway, speaking in front of these two Rinpoches, I feel I'm being examined, but I'll go for it anyway. I know that there is a lot of interest growing to study and practice Buddha Dharma around the world. With these interests lingering in the air, one would think that the Buddhists in general, and especially we Tibetans, we should really facilitate these with a little bit of sense of urgency. But I don't know, somehow maybe we Tibetans are too obsessed with ourselves. Supporting these needs seems to be not in our special agenda. Rangjung Yeshe Institute is one of those rare places where there is this support. And therefore, I must offer my rejoice for its 10 years achievement. I really think this is so crucial for not only for Buddhism, but world in general. As some of you know, and for those who are new, that you can find out, Buddhism is a very reason-oriented path, or a system, whatever you want to call it. It just happens to be, I just happen to have this book in my hand. I'm not really talking about the book, of course. The title I thought was quite catchy. It's written by Amartya Sen. It's called The Argumentative Indian. I like the title very much because I think Buddha was one of the most argumentative. And this spirit of argument and analysis is so crucial for the world in general, and especially Buddhism, especially in the modern times. By the way, I do have a little bit of amnesia, especially when it comes to the Dharma, so I have written few notes. I'll have to refer to this at times. Relatively speaking, it is true that Buddhist philosophy or Buddha Dharma originated from India. And there's something quite interesting about the way the Indian approach to life, and especially something to do with the human endeavor. There's a system called Dharma, Artha, Kama, and Moksha, and this always fascinated me a lot. Dharma, not in the sense of the holy Dharma, but some kind of a structure or moral structure to accomplish the moksha, the liberation. Now there is also the Artha, which talks about leadership, management, warfare, economy, and then there's a Kama, which is enjoying, partying, making merry, basically having the full worldly pleasure or whatever. Now, of course, Buddhism would, as we all know, Buddhism does concentrate more on the moksha, and everything that's related to Buddhism is sort of originated or derived or influenced by the path to the moksha. The reason why I'm mentioning this as I was saying, that to me this is very interesting because, and this system I feel is very Indian way of thinking. As part of the human endeavor, I think within this system, the Indian thinkers have stated many times that there is the dharma or a system, a moral. It could be moral, it could be logic, it could be anything that's rational. And then there is artha, which is something to do with the common sense, I guess. And then there's the kama. Now, I believe that many other philosophical systems maybe lacks the moksha, the last the liberation bit. And this is quite important because what it means is that, let's say, since we all use mobile phone, let's use the mobile phone as an example. Mobile phone is important now, especially for dharma, for artha, and for karma, of course. Because without the mobile phone, you can't have a pleasure, you can't book a restaurant, you can't do anything almost. And then without the mobile phone, you can't have a proper management, let's say. And then there is, of course, some kind of a system related to the mobile phone, prepaid or postpaid or long distance or short distance or a certain package and all that. But the most special is the moksha. I think this is, of course, my own interpretation. When we talk about the moksha, at the end of the day, the Indian thinkings are saying that at the end of the day, actually, mobile phone is an illusion. And this actually makes the whole system very painless if you really adopt, if you sort of really put this into the practice. I think the world always forgets the last, the moksha bit. We think that the mobile phone is the ultimate. It has to work, it will work, it works with everyone. And then, of course, there's a complaint, there's disappointment, there's fights, there's disharmony and all that. And all because we forget the moksha. I'm telling you this because if you look at the Indian thinking of any philosophical system, whether it's I haven't read much, but let's say Hinduism, Jainism, and of course Buddhism, you will feel that they always give you a path. Let's say in Buddhism, there is a path which consists of certain rules and regulations. You have to shave your hair, you have to eat nettle soup, you have to only sit on the cushion, you can't really sit on all these kind of rules and regulations made for different kinds of people. But then, at the end of the path, they always tell you the path is an illusion, that you are not supposed to be attached to the path. I'm sure whether you know this, it's really important that we Buddhists know that Buddha was not a Buddhist. Buddhism is a path. The path of the Buddha Dharma is like a placebo. It is actually created for a specific problem to a specific people. And one is not supposed to attach to the path as the goal. Path, even in the highest Buddhist philosophy, such as the Mahamudra or the Mahasandhi, we hear examples such as when you sharpen the knife, what do you need? You need a whetstone. And then you have the knife. And then you rub these two together. When you rub whetstone and the knife, what is really happening there? Two kinds of exhaustions are happening simultaneously. The whetstone is getting exhausted. At the same time, the metal is also getting exhausted. These two exhaustion is actually referred to as sharp knife. And suddenly there is actually a non-concrete achievement called sharp knife. which is not other than exhaustion of the stone and exhaustion of a metal. Now, this is a really important thinking to make the path, to make the path a path, simply speaking. I'm trying to say that I believe that actually Buddhism, because it sort of, relatively speaking, it came from India, there is this Indian mentality or Indian thinking, which I do appreciate a lot. Many times when you go to India, I'm sure you will get frustrated with all the chaos and disorder, but I believe that this great nation, especially in the past, they have cherished the wisdom so much. And sometimes they cherish wisdom so much, they tend to forget the common sense. In fact, if you think really carefully, to make a path, sort of proper path, enlightened path, I think it's really important to do without the common sense. Because if you really invest so much time and energy to the common sense, at the end of the day, what do you become? You have become another boring, dull human being. Look at us. We are all basically franchised people, so to speak. We are all sort of wearing the similar things, having a sort of similar hairstyle, because we all feel that we should not be outcasted, otherwise we will not be invited for the gala dinner tonight, especially. So, the quest for the spiritual path at times is really forsaking the common sense and related matters, I should say. I want to tell you this. Because this is okay. Okay. Anytime, please stop me. We were talking about how important it is to study Buddhism, especially today. Buddha Shakyamuni said, that everything is matter of conditioning. And I believe education is one of the most crucial conditioning. It is the education that will make the difference in the future. And I believe that if today's education system does have even a scant of Buddhist influence, it will make a big difference in the world. Imagine a member of a Senate in the United States government, someone who has maybe not really a practicing Buddhist, but someone who has quite a good knowledge on interdependent reality, someone who has quite a good understanding on cause, condition, and consequences. I think there will be some difference. Imagine a CEO of American Automobile Association having a little bit of influence of the Buddhist education. I think it will make a big difference. Of course, one might think, is Buddhism relevant today? Isn't it 2,500 years old? Maybe it's already expired. Does it still have any relevance in today's life? Do we need to modify Buddhism in order to suit the thinking of our, today's mind? And if it really does, how does it work? I think it's really important to know that primarily to study Buddhism actually means to study science of oneself. This is really important to know. It is not a study of some ancient text, which happens to be some kind of a survival kit that is written for a specific mountain dweller or a desert dweller. You will not find in the Buddhist scripture how many Buddhist women can have, how many husbands can a Buddhist woman have. There is no specific, sort of rules, so to speak. I haven't seen in the Buddhist sutras how a Buddhist council should punish a bad Buddhist. And there is no strategic studies about how to build a Buddhist nation or a Buddhist state. In fact, I think some people think that the weakness of Buddhism is that it does not offer a concrete answer to a social structure. Of course, others might argue that that very weakness is the Buddhist strength, something to be argued. As many of you know, I believe many of you are students of Rangjung Yeshe Institute. As many of you know, and that you can find out, in Buddhism, essentially we are taught things like that everything is our mind, everything is interdependent, that there is no almighty sponsor, that you are your own master. Now, if you look at these statements, each and every single line, I think, could bring a lot of benefit to individual and the society in general. All these statements the essential Buddhist teachings. Today the world talks about a lot of different problems: ecology, political struggle, identity crisis. If only we invest a little time and energy in some of these statements by the Shakyamuni Buddha, I believe that there will be a difference. Essentially, the study of Buddhism is not really a study of some kind of a moral or a theistic code of conduct. And as I was saying, teachings like all compounded things are impermanent. Everything is interdependent. These are very much up to date. Today, things are very much impermanent, as it was during the Buddha's time. It is not an outdated path. So, we learn that study and practice of Buddhism does not necessarily mean sitting on a cushion or spending time in the cave. It could mean all kinds of different things. I dare say this, but Buddhists in general and the Tibetan Buddhists, I think especially the lamas like myself, I must admit that maybe there's something that there's one thing that we made, a mistake. I think every time we talk about being Buddhist, then our model of how to become a Buddhist always happens to be a begging bowl, bare feet, walking in the Mangadath street, begging alms, or nettle soup, cave. The moment when we hear about the words like renunciation, completely forgetting that there was a lot of other models too. There were great, non-renunciant, so to speak, such as King Ashoka, such as King Harsha, such as all the kings of the Guptas and Palas and Mathuras, King Tisong Diuzan, for instance. I think, of course, this is something to be argued, because somehow that in a place like Tibet, there has been a lot of strong influence from, lamas. And the lamas partially, they sort of promote so-called the renunciation. So, which is interpreted as, leaving the job, leaving the family, so on and so forth. And I dare say, many of the lamas, I was using the word partially. If you look at it, many of the monasteries are just another sort of worldly structure. And somehow, in between these two, I think the real meaning of renunciation is lost. I don't remember the name of this nun, but I'm sure some of you have read the story. I will give you one example of the greatest renunciation. In the ancient time in India, there was a nun, and because it used, India, probably still now, it's a male-domineering society. And this Buddhist nun, she was so concerned about the Buddhist, teaching, degeneration of the Buddha's teaching and so on and so forth. And she really wants to do something. Okay, she's already renounced her life, worldly life, so she's nun. And she realized that as a woman in that society, she couldn't do much. So what did she do? She renounced her bhikshuni vow, and she got married with a king, and then came Asanga, the greatest commentator of some of the most important Buddhist philosophy, Yogacarya school. And as if that was not scandalous enough, she then jilted the prince and married a Brahmin. And then came out Vasubandhu, another great commentator of Yogacarya school, and many important texts today. Now this, I would say, is one of the greatest renunciation. Renouncing the renunciation is probably one of the greatest renunciation. I'm sorry, I do sound a bit like a Buddhist jihadi. There's a lot of, kind of patriotic kind of word, but this is something that you have to put up with me for now. The reason why I'm telling you this is, some of us, maybe we are thinking that Buddhism is in as much danger as many other religions from the forces of modernity and the changes in the attitude towards the spiritual path in general. And I would say some might even try to find Buddhism being kind of complementary to modern science and psychology, rather than the other way around, actually. Trying to sort of complement with science and psychology, that they should be trying to complement with Buddhism. This is what I would think. And I think that in the process, some of us are maybe on the verge of producing kind of a watered-down Buddhism. Now, one thing I need to clarify, it's important to know that as Buddhism traveled to different parts of the world in different times, of course, different culture and different tradition and different habit has always been used as a vehicle to teach the Buddha Dharma. That's the only way. We human beings must have a culture, otherwise we cannot even communicate. And many times, Buddha himself, skillfully, with a great compassion, used those culture as a means to interpret, convey the wisdom. But you see, the thing is, many of these traditions, culture, habit, has now, unfortunately, I would say, unfortunately, they have become virtually synonymous to Buddhism. And this is one big, this is something that we have to watch out. So, some of us, when we have this fear that maybe we need to change Buddhism to suit American mind, Danish mind, I don't know, Nepalese mind, probably we are talking about this, probably we are talking about needing to change the culture and the tradition and the method of delivering the Buddha Dharma. And that, from my point of view, is perfectly fine, because what we need to protect is the Buddha's wisdom, not the Japanism or Tibetanism or, that culturally oriented method. Of course, this is much easier said than done, because, as I said, the culture and the tradition and the wisdom of the Buddha has virtually, it has become synonymous in many different aspects. So, keeping that in our mind, I think it is worthwhile to, the students here, especially because you came, the Rangjung Yeshe Institute hosts students from all different parts of the world. I think it is worthwhile to really consider and really ponder about not to change the Buddha's teaching, such as all compounded things are impermanent. You don't need to change that. You can't change that. And if you change that, you'll be making a mistake. But how to deliver this? And there are questions like, okay, for instance, like the different usage of language or the examples. For instance, traditionally when we talk about the Four Noble Truths, let's say when we talk about the truth of suffering, traditionally we use examples or the analogies such as, the suffering, the analogy for the suffering is like birth, death, old age, sickness, and so on. But maybe we can, comfortably include unemployment, pension plan, I don't know, the political situations in the world. You know, for instance, if you talk about illusion, you know, we can give example of dreams and rainbows and, you know, mirage and all that. But we could, I think, also use, if you are talking to a, let's say, a student from any, like let's say maybe MBA, like those who are interested in economy. If you look at the system of the economy today, it is the greatest illusion, one of the greatest illusion. And this could be very well used as a means to express. It is, and when I say illusion, it's not just a, I don't mean in, you know, as, you know, like, I'm not looking, I'm not sort of downgrading this, as you all know. The economy, the system of economy today. I was very surprised to read about economy, and there's something to do with what gross national product. Is it a gross national product? And when you count what is the gross national product, the depletion, for instance, like a country is judged by saying that this country is wealthy by having how many papers, never thinking about how much trees have been chopped down. You know, all the, sort of the depreciation, depletion is not even counted there. So that's like the greatest illusion, and yet people follow that. For instance, on the force of, service industry, so many mothers, when they look after the babies, it's a voluntary work. Nobody pays. But because this kind of voluntary work does not bring, cannot be claimed as tax by the government, this kind of voluntary work is not even considered as part of the job. And that, I find, is a greatest illusion again. And if you look at these things, actually, it is kind of scary. Sometimes I think, if all these lamas going to around different parts of the world and teaching Buddha Dharma, from the economy point of view, I would say, it's great that many of these teachings point are being missed, and not many people are practicing from the economist's point of view. Because if everybody become a really good practitioner, economy will collapse. If, from the economist's point of view, isn't it? So, what I was trying to say is, some of these examples, some of these analogy or the term are something that we can maybe take advantage and try to interpret, can use as a means to interpret the Buddha's core teachings, such as the Four Noble Truths and Four Dharmas, or the Four Seal of the Buddha. And anyway, to summarize, as I was saying, in the Indian thinking system, there seems to be something called Dharma, Artha, Kama, and moksha. Buddhism, a system without the moksha, will not become a complete Buddhist path. And as simple state as it might sound, we have to be careful because many times we forget the moksha bit. We put more importance on the dharma. What I'm trying to say, I'll end with this. Final aim or the goal of us Buddhists is not to become Buddhist. That's it. Please, if you have questions.
Thank you very much, Rinpoche, for the wonderful talk. My name is Alex Yiannopoulos, and I'm a researcher here, and I'm currently writing a book on the topic of the Buddha Dharma and translation. And I was wondering if you could speak a bit more about the movement, or how you see the movement of the Buddha Dharma from culture to culture, or from individual to individual, as regards something I'm very interested in, which is the teachings on the lack of inherent existence, or the lack of, or anatman. Because from my perspective, but I'm much more interested in yours, the central teaching on the lack of inherent existence enables movement across cultures or across individuals, because there is no one single thing that is being transmitted, no svabhava, no rangjin. In a sense, the method of transmission becomes irrelevant, and what we're talking about escapes any particular determination on linguistic, cultural, personal lines. But I really would like to hear you speak on that.
Okay, so how would the Rangjin Mappa travel from one country to the another country? Basically, that's what you're talking about, isn't it?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
We gotta try. You know, I think generally in the world, some kind of small element of this Rangjin Mappa does exist within every culture. You know, there's an expression, English expression, what? Appearance is deceiving. Now that's a good one, actually. That's quite good. That could be used as an igniter of the emptiness teaching. Because when we, okay, I hate to quote this because there may be a riot here, but you know, I'm a kind of a secret admirer of Osho Rajneesh. And you know, he said something very interesting. He said, in Buddhist no, he said there is 1 million yes. And I think that's a very profound statement. You know, no this, no that, no nose, no eyes, no ears, all that. He said, in Buddhist no, inside the Buddhist no, there is 1 million yes. I thought that was quite an important statement. Anyway, appearance is deceiving is something that we could start with. And to be honest, even Shakyamuni Buddha himself said that the emptiness can be only, the ultimate truth can be only understood through the, trust or the devotion. So after a while, our analysis and our logic on our rationalism has to exhaust. Otherwise, something called logic, I'm sure you may have studied here. Do you know, fundamentally, logic is the systematic door to illogic.
My name is Tenzin Kelsang. I'm sorry for my voice. I just came from New York City last week. And my home is in Bir, and I know Rinpoche since I was a young boy. And also my late mother is one of the main teachers, Khenpo Kunga Wangchuk. And on behalf of 6 million Tibetan people, I would love to say thank you for Eminence Chunyi Rinpoche and also Dzongsa Jinze Rinpoche and Tsongyi Rinpoche. And I have two questions for Rinpoche. I'm sure the Rinpoche know a lot of modern Buddhist ideas. And my first point of view is I've been in the West for the last 12 years. Also, I come back 4 months a year or 6 months a year to India and Nepal. Even I was raised a monk since I was 10, still I feel Buddhism is not easy for myself. And we can talk a lot about Buddhism, but always I found, even I talked to my friend Geshe this morning, he woke up at 3 o'clock this morning and he's doing 100,000 prostration every day. And he's living and teaching in Nepal for the last 1 year. And we talk a lot about different issues, Buddhism and modern science or political. So my last two questions make a little bit complicated question. First of all,
I didn't get this question first. Was that a question?
no, I'm just expressing my experience
okay,
with the
okay.
modern Buddhist teachers and traditional Buddhist teacher, no? So Geshe-la lived almost 30 years teaching and learning in India and Nepal, in Europe, in the West. And my first question is, in the Western field I felt, and I met a lot of Western Buddhists, maybe some could be scholar, and I always felt that they're having a lot of lack of faith. In Buddhism, faith is also very important. Of course, common sense faith with the interdependent knowledge kind of faith. And without faith, sometimes it's hard only reading a book and studying a book. It's becoming more like intellectual knowledge. And some kind of scholars or Geshe or Lamas or monks called modern Buddhists, you know, always, Samdo Rinpoche always says, we can't mix up too much Buddhism in the modern world, you know. And basically I was also thinking that in Rinpoche's view, you live in Bir, also you live and travel in the world. But you've done 2 movies in this world, which is very popular. And how do you call like monastic system and traditional who are raised like a Tibetan or Bhutanese, born in the Eastern culture or Eastern country, to raise that kind of Buddhist faith and raise and live like a full-time job in America, Europe, which is like 5 days a week.
Okay.
And
You were talking about the faith.
Faith is one question. The second question is,
Wait, as I said before, I have amnesia. So I will not remember if you say everything now. So let me answer you this first.
thank you.
Okay? Good. I believe there's 3 kinds of faith or devotion. I'm just making this up. So if there's anything wrong, you can, refute me. There's an irrational faith. If somebody tells you you should do 100,000 prostrations because after you die, you will reborn in heaven so that you can have 74 virgin girls. And if you believe in that, this is what I call irrational faith. And that is something that we don't want. You understand? And then there is a rational faith, which according to Saraha, he said, actually devotion is trusting to cause, condition and effect. Now that is something that we should have, but only for temporarily. And then our aim is to go beyond irrational and rational devotion. But that is almost like a goal. I guess you can say the problem with the modern world is it's too skeptical and too critical. At times, we may be loving too much, in love so much with so-called rationalism. So, okay, we may be managing to get rid of the irrational devotion, but maybe we are stuck with the rational devotion. And this is where maybe we can try to transcend these two. I don't know whether I'm even answering your question. I haven't even actually properly understood your question. Anyway, please go ahead with your second.
Yeah, second is, as a Rinpoche born in the Eastern monasteries and teaching in the West for last maybe more than 20, 30 years. And my another question is, sometimes when we teach in the Western world, some lamas or geshes, monks, they make too much teaching based on Western people's thought. And sometimes I feel that the essence or originally Tibetan or whatever you call, Indian Buddhist or whatever you call. So I felt that the essence of purity of Buddhism is losing in the Western world. At the same time, the Buddhism is getting more like a fashionism in the Western world. My friends call New Age in New York City.
Okay.
So my worry is too much teaching based on Western mind. So we're losing the essence of Buddhism in this world. So that is always Holy Dalai Lama admired, that we should teach more like accurate of Tibetan Buddhism. So we should not too much based on what Western people want or Eastern people want. So we should teach based on Buddha's teaching. So it should be more pure forever. Otherwise we lose the essence. Within 20 years we lose the purity of Buddhism.
Okay.
So Rinpoche, please give me your experience in Western idea or Tibetan ideas. Rinpoche's answer. Thank you.
Well, that's the point I was trying to make before. There's a core teaching of the Buddha, such as the impermanence, such as the compassion. Let's take compassion as an example. Compassion must be taught and must be practiced by everyone, Tibetan, American, doesn't matter. But when we teach compassion, probably because of the cultural background of different people, we might need to use different kinds of language. For instance, like for Tibetans, maybe it's okay if you say, Ma namkadanyam bisamjin tamche, all beings are mother and so on and so forth. In the West, especially those who have read so much Freud, they don't like mothers. You understand? So, if you are telling them that you should have compassion towards all mother sentient beings, it's not going to really do, you may not be able to deliver that message. But that's okay, because that's not the core, the example, the method that we are using is not the core teaching of the Buddha, the essential teaching of the Buddha. The essential teaching of the Buddha is the compassion. How you deliver this, how you insert this in people's mind, it does not really matter. I'm sure if we are teaching a group of Jupiter citizens, we might have to use different ways to teach them, like maybe compassion is beating each other up. Bit too far, but I'm saying I would not worry as long as we are keeping the actual teaching intact. I would not worry so much about the how and the methods that we use. Of course, having said that, there are certain elements. Let's say if you are teaching Vajrayana, attributes such as a Vajra and a bell. I think it would be difficult to argue, saying that, well, since everything is emptiness and since everything is pure, why not we hold with the right hand a mobile phone and the left hand, laptop instead of a Vajra and a bell? Now, I don't think that's really possible because, first of all, there's no authorities as such. We need a great Tertun who would authorize this. And then these days, we don't know who is great Tertun and who is not. And secondly, attributes such as Vajra and bell, even though it may have come from India, it has its, for instance, representation and symbolic teachings, and they are so beautiful. For instance, like a Vajra, the spoke of the Vajra coming from Chusin is called, what is it, monster or crocodile? Chusin, what is it? Sea monster, okay. The spoke of the spoke which represents the wisdom, but coming out of a sea monster, which represents that wisdom comes from the emotion and so on and so forth, which you really can't do with a mobile phone.
Dal from Tribhuvan University. I would like to ask one question. As you have talked extensively about the world affairs, I would like to put question on this area only. You may be well informed that both Bhutan and Sri Lanka are the Buddhist country where Buddhist faiths are very much dominant in both politics and people in their way of life also. But as you know that both these countries are involved in ethnic cleansing, as people in some parts of that country speak different language or have the different colors of the face. As a lover of the Buddhist faith, I feel very shame that this faith, which explains about the compassion, are involved in the ethnic cleansing simply because they are of different nature. As you spoke extensively about the world affairs, what would you like to express these views? And is it not the duty of the Buddhist scholar to help solve these problems? Thank you.
Okay. First of all, I'd like to tell you, there's a difference, of course you know this, there's a difference between Buddhism and Buddhist. Buddhism is what? All compounded things are impermanent, everything is not inherently non-existent, so on and so forth. Pure, uncorruptible, simple, right? Now, Buddhist, well, you are looking at one at the moment, corruptible, contrivable. Yes, why? Because beings like myself, Buddhists, we are just a human being. You understand? Just because, I think this is quite an important question, because this kind of question has been raised in many different occasions, intentionally or unintentionally. You know, I've even experienced this. One day there was I saw a person who became monk. Okay, he shaved his hair under the Bodhi tree, actually. And next day he was fighting with a rickshaw driver right outside the rickshaw, not fighting, fist fighting, but arguing really violently almost. And then next to me there's a Westerner who said, isn't he a Buddhist? How come he's not controlling his emotion? People have this kind of expectation that the moment you change, the moment you take refuge, you will change everything. If we could, how nice it will be. But that's not possible. But to really conclude your question, I would say, as I said, I'm a Buddhist jihadi. I would say, I would still give a credit to these country people. The fact that they're Buddhist, I'm sure there is at least an awkward feeling to many of these people. And that's important, because at least the path itself does not say all non-Bhutanese or non-Sri Lankans are infidels. You have to kill them. By killing them, they will go to heaven. Okay?
This will be the last question, please.
Good.
Rinpoche, thank you so much for coming. The phrase watering down came up in your talk, and it strikes me, my name is John McCransky from Boston College, and I've thought about that phrase a lot. It seems to be used in different ways by different people. It's kind of a hot phrase. Some people seem to mean by watering down anything fresh. Like you were saying about in teaching compassion, start a different way with Westerners. Some people would call that watering down. It should be just the way it's worked before. Mm-hmm. Watering down means what works in the prior culture. Some other people might mean by watering down divorcing the Dharma from the moksha. Mm-hmm. Just trying to meet worldly desires and needs within a culture, divorced from the moksha aspect, which also came up in your talk. But it also is a bit complicated because the Dharma has also been used, like by Tibetan doctors, to just heal, try to help people to heal without necessarily lecturing them that they have to get enlightened. Mm-hmm. You're just helping. It's like an expression of compassion, meeting worldly needs and desires. Could you comment on this phrase, watering down, whether it's still a useful phrase, and if so, in what way?
Actually, to be honest, I actually don't know. But I think what I was concerned is, okay, let me be bold a little bit here. Sometimes I hear that, in the West, and especially in India, there are Buddhists who does not believe in reincarnation. Now that puzzles me, because to me, if there is no next life, I will not give even one thought, one moment of pondering to rob a bank. Why not? As long as I'm not caught by police, who cares? Because all I have is this life. I want to have a swimming pool, heated actually. So what I mean by water down is to soothe I think in India, I'm sure you know all this, Dalit and all of these, people who are against probably the Hindu culture of caste system, somehow they have strayed themselves into saying that, well, if there is a karma and a reincarnation, then there will be, like the caste system and all of that. And I don't know what is I'm sure in the West maybe, as I was saying, reincarnation is, and I admit that, especially on the Mahayana level, reincarnation is really quite difficult to prove. Almost all the logic that we have is sort of arbitrary, until the Mahayana level I'm talking about. And on the Vajrayana level, I believe that you can actually really give a really good reasoning, but in order to do that, you have to initiate give the initiation to whoever is asking the questions, and that's the difficulty. So that's what I mean by, I guess maybe diluting is the word I should be using. Anyway, once again, thank you to Rinpoche's here, and Chogyam Nyingma Rinpoche's to bring me here. I do really have a strong wish and aspiration that Chogyam Nyingma Rinpoche and Tsongyi Rinpoche's Dhamma activities will flourish. This morning, Chogyam Nyingma Rinpoche came to my place and we were talking about the translation. And I was mentioning to him that recently I heard from somebody, a Tibetan scholar, he said, well, we have to translate all the Buddhist texts into different language because even within the Tibetan, in about 10 years, there will be no more young Tibetans who actually speak the Dharma language. And that's kind of scary. I believe, as we can see, Chogyam Nyingma Rinpoche has so much, strength and maybe he must have been to management course or a leadership course. And I see a lot of things happening. Myself, so lazy, really not wanting to do any of these things. But nevertheless, I will have the aspiration.